reading and basis for our sermon today is from the work of a British author, Karen Armstrong. And Karen is just a British way of saying Karen. And I know if Colin and Judy were here, they would attest to the trueness of that fact. Karen Armstrong is the author of many books on religious affairs, including The History of God, The Battle for God, Holy War Islam, Buddha, The Great Transformation, and she's written a couple of memoirs as well. And she's kind of important out there in the world of religion. She's addressed members of the U.S. Congress on 3 occasions, lectured to policymakers at the U.S. State Department. She's participated in the World Economic Forum 3 times and is now an ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilizations. But one of the things she's most noted for is in 2008, Karen Armstrong won a TED Prize, and that's TED of the TED Talk fame. And along with her TED Talk prize, she was granted a wish. Her wish asked the TED organization to help her assemble something called the Charter for Compassion, a document around which religious leaders can work together for peace. So in late fall 2008, the first draft of the charter was written, she says, by the world, because it was written online via a sharing website. And then in February 2009, the words were collected and given to a Council of Conscience, which was a gathering of religious leaders and thinkers who crafted the final document. So this Charter for Compassion was launched in November 2009. And this reading is from the preface to Karen Armstrong's book, The 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. She writes, one of the chief tasks of our time must surely be to build a global community in which all peoples can live together in mutual respect. Yet religion, which should be making a major contribution, is seen as part of the problem. All faiths insist that compassion is the test of true spirituality and that it brings us into relation with the transcendence we call God, Brahman, Nirvana, or Tao. Each has formulated its own version of what is sometimes called the Golden Rule. Do not treat others as you would not like them to treat you. Or in its positive form, always treat others as you would wish to be treated yourself. Further, they all insist that you cannot confine your benevolence to your own group. You must have concern for everybody, even your enemies. And that's where it gets hard. Yet sadly, we hear little about compassion these days. I have lost count of the number of times I have jumped into a London taxi and when the cabbie asks how I make a living, have been informed categorically that religion has been the cause of all the major wars in history. In fact, the causes of conflict are usually greed, envy, and ambition, but in an effort to sanitize them, these self-serving emotions have often been cloaked in religious rhetoric. There has been much flagrant abuse of religion in recent years. Terrorists have used their faith to justify atrocities that violate its most sacred values. And of course, in the Roman Catholic Church, popes and bishops have ignored the suffering of countless women and children by turning a blind eye to the sexual abuse committed by their priests. Some religious leaders seem to believe, like secular politicians, singing the praises of their own denomination and decrying their rivals with scant regard for charity. In their public pronouncements, they rarely speak of compassion, but focus instead on such secondary matters as sexual practices, the ordination of women, or abstruse doctrinal definitions implying that a correct stance on these issues, rather than the Golden Rule, is the criterion of true faith. Yet it's hard to think of a time when the compassionate voice of religion has been so sorely needed. Our world is dangerously polarized. There is a worrying imbalance of power and wealth, and as a result, a growing rage, malaise, alienation, and humiliation that have erupted in terrorist atrocities that endanger us all. We are engaged in wars that we seem unable either to end or to win. Disputes that were secular in origin, such as the Arab-Israeli conflict, have been allowed to fester and become holy, and once they have been sacralized, positions tend to harden and become resistant to pragmatic solutions. And yet at the same time, we are bound together more closely than ever before through the electronic media. Suffering and want are no longer confined to distant disadvantaged parts of the globe. When stocks plummet in one country, there is a domino effect in markets all over the world. What happens today in Gaza or Afghanistan is now likely to have repercussions tomorrow in London or in New York. We all face the terrifying possibility of environmental catastrophe. In a world in which small groups will increasingly have powers of destruction hitherto confined to the nation state, it has become imperative to apply the golden rule globally, ensuring that all peoples are treated as we wish to be treated ourselves. If our religious and ethical traditions fail to address this challenge, they will fail the test of our time. So TED helped me to create, launch, and propagate a charter for compassion that would be written by leading thinkers from a variety of major faiths and would restore compassion to the heart of religious and moral life. The charter would counter the voices of extremism, intolerance, and hatred at a time when religions are widely assumed to be at loggerheads. It would also show that despite our significant differences, on this we are all in agreement, and that it is indeed possible for the religions to reach across the divide and work together for peace and justice. So I'm going to end this reading by reading you the actual Charter for Compassion. The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions, calling us to always treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves. Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures, to dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there, and to honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being, treating everybody without exception with absolute justice, equity, and respect. It is also necessary in both public and private life to refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain. To act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest, to impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody, and to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies, is a denial of our common humanity. We acknowledge that because we have failed to live compassionately, and that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion. We therefore call upon all people to restore compassion to the center of morality and religion, to return to the ancient principle that any interpretation of Scripture that breeds violence, hatred, or disdain is illegitimate, to ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information about other traditions, religions, and cultures, to encourage a positive appreciation of cultural and religious diversity, to cultivate an informed empathy with the suffering of all human beings, even those regarded as enemies. We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world. Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness, compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity. It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community. All right, that's a lot to think about. I first became aware of the work of Karen Armstrong in 2011 when she was the Ware lecturer at the UUA's General Assembly. That's our Unitarian Universalist Association, our annual national meeting, and the Ware lecture is sort of the famous lecture. Just to give you an idea, Dr. King was a Ware lecturer back in the 60s. It's kind of a big deal for us. And actually, her hour-long address to the General Assembly from 2011 is still available on the UUA website in full, in both text and video. And the Charter of Compassion at that time, 2011, had only been in existence for 2 years. and her book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, had only been published 1 year earlier. But in her Where lecture, she told us a lot of what was in that earlier reading I just shared with you. But there are some additional things from her address that really have stuck with me. She said, "The healing of the world is possible through the practice of compassion." And she defines compassion, she goes back to the roots of the word. She says it's defined as a feeling of distress at the suffering of another and a desire to alleviate the suffering. Compassion means to suffer with. Although the suffering is not mine, I choose to feel it like it is mine, and I feel that so intensely that I feel compelled to do something about it. That's some powerful stuff there. She says we should shift our focus, our religious focus, to how we treat others. She said religious doctrine isn't as important here. How we behave is. We need to implement the golden rule globally so that we treat all people, all nations, as we would wish to be treated ourselves. Otherwise, our world is not viable. This is the real test of spirituality. So you can see the sense of urgency in that she really does have a point here. She said, it's compassion that takes us beyond the prison of ego and selfishness and greed and enables us to be our best selves and be closest to the divine. You know, I think a lot of us might have done some serious time in the prison of ego. You know, I've done some time. Anyone else done time in the prison of ego? All right, thank you all for confessing. We don't usually take confessions, but I appreciate it. I mean, I've done lots of time there. You know, Buddhism teaches us that it's our egos that do get us into trouble and create a lot of our own self-inflicted misery. And compassion is really a natural antidote. It's a way to liberate ourselves from the prison, the control, the dominance of our own egos, our own self-centeredness. Another saying that has stuck with me is that we must dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there. That is a really powerful and really challenging image. It encouraged me to envision what my throne looks like. You know, because if you're going to dethrone yourself, you have to know what your throne, you know, what throne you're leaving behind, right? Well, my personal throne in the center of my world, it's really, really comfortable. It's actually a lazy boy recliner. And on my throne, I have this super-powered remote control. And I can flip through all the channels of the world, and I can judge everything that I don't like or annoys me. I can condemn everyone who hurts me or just irritates me. And I can click right past all of that pain and suffering of others. Because, you know, it's really not my problem. I mean, why would any person in their right mind want to give up such an amazing throne? But there is a reason. You know, compassion is that reason. It requires me to leave my luxury and allow others to rest there for a while, put their feet up. And in return, I get rewarded with feeling the pain of the other, and I have to work to alleviate it. So if you think compassion is a weak and mushy thing or something akin to pity, it's not. Real compassion, it is courageous. It is not for the faint of heart. I mean, wimps need not apply. But it also means that compassion doesn't require us to be abused or be taken advantage of. In fact, compassion only works when there are good boundaries. Otherwise, we can disguise things like enabling as compassion or coercive or controlling behaviors as compassion, you know, that I know what's best for you kind of thing. Compassion isn't about a martyr complex or a savior complex or a hero complex. And there's one particular part of this charter for compassion that is really challenging for me. That clause about not inflicting pain, not speaking or acting violently out of spite or self-interest, not inciting hatred by denigrating others. I'm okay until the last three words. Even our enemies, right? Then it's just like, whoa, my mind has been blown. I mean, that is some high-level spiritual development right there, right? Don't even talk trash about your enemies, okay? I have not achieved that level of sainthood, not even close. I mean, it's so hard to have compassion for people we see as having hurt us, or people we see as might being able to inflict more pain upon us, even if it's just emotional pain. And that's my sticking point. You know, and it's so hard not to vent and not to complain about that. You know, so-and-so, blah, 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 blah. In her address, Armstrong described this habit of denigrating, or what I more informally call trash talking, as a form of addiction. And I think she's right. You know, we actually get a buzz when we sound off about things and people that displease us. But compassion expects more, because everything you put out there is important. It has significance. Fortunately, she wrote us a 12-step book to get over this addiction, the 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. And there's not enough time to go into the whole 12 steps in any depth today, but in case you're curious about what they involve, I'll just run through the list quickly. The first step is actually to learn about compassion. So everyone here today is actually, you know, taking a big chunk out of that step right there. You're doing great. The second step through the 12th, I'll just run through them, is look at your own world. Having compassion for yourself, cultivating empathy, cultivating mindfulness, taking action, learning how little we know, learning how should we speak to one another, having concern for everybody, having knowledge, having recognition, and she saved the hardest for last, love your enemies. And of course, although there's a pretty strong case for being compassionate, there's still people out there who will say, well, why bother? What's in it for me? My own suffering is bad enough. Why should I try and feel someone else's suffering? And what if they brought the suffering on themselves, right? The classic argument, right? I mean, compassion is worth practicing because it's ultimately in everyone's interest. It's a little selfish in that regard. It's because we're all interconnected. The world is connected, you know, digitally, economically, financially, environmentally, and how we treat people in one place as individuals, as communities, as nations, has an impact how we are in turn treated. And that's why we need to practice compassion, to suffer with and take time to feel the pain of others. Not to the degree that we are pulled into the depths of despair or unable to function in our lives. That really isn't helping anyone. But even short, brief emotional visits into the suffering of others can be transformational, bringing us back from these really super desensitized lives we live, moving us from self-righteous anger to true empathy regarding the tragic conditions of a good portion of the world and its people. What we do affects everyone, no matter how different from us or how far away from us. We can no longer afford to pretend that we are apart from the suffering that is felt in other parts of the world or in the neighborhood just down the street. It's too easy to click past it, but compassion calls us to sit with it and feel it, and then we will be compelled to do something about it. So in her lecture, Karen Armstrong said, why shouldn't the UUs come forward and spread compassion throughout the world? And of course, everyone cheered and they liked that idea. I hope you like that idea too. We should be on the leading edge of this. After all, compassion isn't our second principle, and we talk about this whole interconnected thing all the time. And actually, a lot has happened since this lecture in 2011, both in the world and regarding the Charter for Compassion. Today, there are hundreds of cities in 50 countries throughout the world that have signed on with the Charter to become compassionate cities. And with some light Googling, and just limiting it to Texas, you will find a compassionate Fort Worth, a compassionate San Antonio, a compassionate Houston, and a compassionate Dallas, all going through or having gone through the steps to become a compassionate community. And it usually kind of is culminated in a city government affirming the Charter for Compassion by resolution. And now it appears that the Charter for Compassion may be coming to Corpus Christi. And there's a story there. I'll get to the point eventually. You might have to hang on a moment. But So I joined a board a couple of years ago for a new organization in town. It's